We've got flags and banners, and if you mind your manners, we might even get to standards and what they represent. So just take my voice's hand and we'll both try to understand how this VexHead Logic podcast could be flagged for content. Flagged for content.
What's up, VexHeads, and welcome to episode 40 of Flagged for Content. It's the only podcast that actually ate a different podcast this week. And what I mean by that, obviously, is that this episode was recorded for the podcast A Kiwi, two Brits, and a Yank Talk Flags, hosted by the incredible Dave and Tracy from Flag Session, the inimitable Terith Peacock from Flags and 50, and some guy named Joey. Kidding, Joey. That would be Joey B, the flag guy from Instagram. Love you, Joey. If those names sound familiar, they have all been guests on this show before and surely will again. If those names don't sound familiar, you need to subscribe and follow Flag Session and Flags in 50 wherever you can, because this episode actually will not play unless it detects that you're following them as well. I would just go do that. I wouldn't bother checking. You're wasting valuable time by doing that. In any case, all credit for the idea and editing of this episode go to the folks over there at K2BY, and specifically, thanks for the edit, Dave. It saved me a lot of time. In any case, you'll notice the format of this one is a bit different. I would love to know what everyone thinks of it, so hit us up on the socials and let me know if you'd like more episodes similar to this. If you listen somewhere you can give reviews or ratings, please do so. I wish it wasn't such an important metric, but unfortunately it is. And follow us or subscribe on all the platforms too. It really sincerely helps. Another thing that helps is Patreon subscriptions. If you don't know what Patreon is, it's a space for creatives of all stripes to produce content that you can subscribe to like on a yearly or monthly basis. For our show, that means mostly bonus episodes, among a couple other things like ad-free episodes and patron shoutouts. At the $5 level, you get one bonus ep per month. At the $10 level, you get two. And of course, no ads, especially on audio. I know those can be pretty jarring when they pop up. There is a $2 level too that's just ad-free episodes, so worth checking that out. And like I said, everything helps. And lastly, one more thing that helps support the show is using our discount codes. It also helps you. If you head over to flagsforgood.com/flagged4content, like the number 4, and use code flagged4content, spelled the same way, that will help you help me by getting you 10% off anything you get over there. So kind of a win. And if you are in the UK or Europe, you cannot beat Mr. Flag in Wales, and you can use code FFC to get 10% off over there as well. I can personally vouch for both of these vendors since I have way too many flags from both of them. And that's it. The last thing I wanted to say before we get into the episode is that for the foreseeable future, the show is going to go back to being every other week. I have a busy end of the summer here where I'm going to be out of town a lot. And I want to make sure I can put out a quality show, not just release one for the sake of releasing one. So we will get back to weekly at some point, but for the next couple months, it probably will be every other week. In any case, enjoy this episode on taboo flags presented by Dave, Tracy, Terith, Joey, and myself. Let's jump in.
Welcome, dear listener, to a very special A Kiwi, two Brits, and two Yanks this time. And it's special for two reasons. A, because, as I said, we've got two Yanks this time. And B, because it's a very different topic to what we normally cover in this podcast. But first, introductions. Let me introduce you to our Kiwi, Dave, and his lovely wife, Tracy. Say hello.
Hey, guys.
And I'm your second Brit, Terith. That's hi from me. And our last two Yanks, we've got the regular Joey B, who hasn't missed an episode yet so far. Say hi, Joey.
Hello.
And we're delighted and privileged to be joined by the host extraordinaire from Flags for Good podcast, Flagged for Content, Andy. Welcome, Andy, to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Lovely hat.
Lovely hat.
Thrilling to be here on this special one.
I'm excited to cover all these different topics, and of course, Abby, to listen to your wonderful, because I've got a particular interest in the flags that you're going to cover, but we'll come to that all shortly, because we're discussing taboo flags this time. We'll be delving into the backgrounds of flags that are either banned or banished in certain parts of the world. Some flags were either covering have either appeared to be part of the forgotten history and therefore still very much in use today, but their true meaning has either been silenced or conveniently removed from the history books. But we'll cover all of that shortly, and it will all become clear as we go through each of our related flags. But first, to start us off, I'll turn to our Kiwi, Dave, who came up with this lovely, light-hearted topic for the episode. Dave, is there anything else that you would like to add?
Yes, thank you, Terrace. Great intro, by the way. Yes, so for those who don't know us, I'm Dave. This is Trace. We're Flag Session. We hide out here in New Zealand, and we're more known for quirky, fun, flaggy competitions and all things that are, poking fun at flags most of the time. But today we thought it would be great to dive into a more serious, darker side of flags. Tracy, would you like to embellish on that a bit more?
Yeah, and as Dave mentioned, obviously we are a platform where we embrace fun with flags, and we always push politics aside. But it's interesting that we find ourselves talking about taboo flags, and clearly it's going to get political for one day only.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're kicking off with the swastika, the Nazi flag. So yeah, doesn't get much worse than that.
No, a bit of a heavy hitter to kick things off,
So we're going to bring it up on screen here. You're looking at a flag where white is for nationalism, red for socialism, and the swastika is for the Aryan race. In the Western world, the swastika is associated with fascism, and let's face it, pure evil. But it goes back thousands of years, and it's been used as a symbol of good fortune in almost every culture in the world.
And that's interesting, because I didn't actually know that until we started looking up the background of the swastika. It was really interesting to know that you could take something so evil in the world and realize it used to be such a positive symbol, and it actually still is. So in the ancient Indian language of Sanskrit, the swastika means well-being, and the symbol has been used by the Hindus, Buddhists, and the Jains for hundreds of years. The swastika symbol is commonly used before entrances or doorways on homes and temples all throughout Asia. So who knew that? So up on screen now, we've got a picture of the Jain flag, and you can see the swastika right in the center, and also on this Hindu temple where it's in the doorway and all over, the entrance. So also by the beginning of the 20th century, there was a huge fad for the swastika as a benign good luck symbol. And as you can see here on screen, it was used on Coca-Cola in the 1920s. So it's been used all throughout the world in many different ways before, obviously Nazi Germany changed the image and direction of the meaning. So also we've got the Swastika girls hockey team from Edmonton in Canada in around 1916. Their outfit for promoting, their uniform was covered in swastikas, as you can see on screen now as well. So then moving forward, the swastika was completely banned in Germany at the end of the war, about 1945. Germany tried to unsuccessfully introduce an EU-wide ban in 2007. And it's completely illegal to fly the swastika Nazi flag in many countries, but not actually all of them. So in New Zealand, it's actually legal to fly outside on your flagpole, from your window, wherever you like. It is completely legal. And we actually, unfortunately, experienced the horror of witnessing a guy walking down our street when we were in Hamilton wearing a Nazi flag draped around himself. So he was a gang member, and that's one of the symbols they use in their gang. And it's actually, I think, the Adolf Hitler banner, specifically what he had draped around him. So yeah, there's a little bit. You can see that on screen as well. We got a photo of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the swastika is often seen in Southeast Asian markets as well. And we've come across younger Chinese people on social media, you know, flying the flag, not in an offensive way, not meaning to be offensive or understanding it, but obviously it's probably due to the lack of education around World War II and the Holocaust. But from a design point of view, you know, it is a very striking flag.
It is.
You know, we'd never buy or fly it. It's obviously something that promotes hate, and it's used by people in violent protests, by white supremacists and gang members who want to rebel or express hate. I don't know, maybe when World War II becomes ancient history, in hundreds of years, it can be known for its original meaning, but definitely not in our lifetime.
No, no chance.
So yeah, it's pretty horrific.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a little bit of the background. So again, a symbol that was meant for good turned into something evil by one of the most evil people that's ever lived. And again, this is why, you know, it would be totally disrespectful to all the people who lost their lives under this banner. It would be completely disrespectful to fly it, which is why it's a taboo flag, definitely in our opinion, and why one should never fly this.
We're going to mention our, because we have a lot of gangs in New Zealand, which people are probably surprised by because people think we just have sheep and mountains, but we have a lot of gangs. And one of the most prominent gangs is the Mongrel Mob, and it's predominantly a Māori gang. And it's really interesting that they use the swastika a lot in their meeting houses and at protests. And when they've been questioned about it, they're saying it's not about being pro-Nazi, it's about being anti-society and offending the crown.
Yes.
But again, it's still just used to promote hate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because it is definitely like predominantly like a white supremacist symbol, but the Mongrel Mob are predominantly Māori Pacific Islanders, which are brown skin, obviously, so they're not using it in that connotation. They're using it to just promote anti-society, anti-government, going against the grain, and they also use the flag of the Confederacy, you know, as well. And interestingly, in some Asian countries, Hitler is actually considered a hero because they're not taught what actually happened in World War II. A dictator is considered to be someone who brings the country up and makes things better. Hence why you'll see Hitler's face and the Nazi flag glorified in certain places around the world, which I found absolutely crazy. I can't believe the truth about this isn't being promoted everywhere. But yes, also a couple of countries where there is no laws against displaying the swastika. So obviously New Zealand, Spain, some Australian states, Thailand, South Korea, Canada, USA, and the UK. You can fly the flag. Unbelievable. I would have thought countries like that would know better. And considering they're the countries that fought against Nazi Germany, I would have thought that maybe, you know, I guess because they are some democracies, you've got freedom of speech and freedom to do what you want, you know. Others might disagree with that sentiment, but yeah. So there we go. Oh, what about the countries where it's illegal?
Yeah, it's illegal. Interestingly, in Brazil, Germany, Austria, Belarus, France, Latvia, Russia, Ukraine, China, and Poland. Yeah.
So there we have it. So that's a bit of a wrap. I don't know if you guys want to jump in with your thoughts.
I had one historical, somewhat recent history bit about it, is that the Finnish Air Force used it for, I think like 60, 70, like they used it for over 50 years. And it was just in the 2000s, maybe 2010s even, that they stopped using it as their Air Force, like on the Air Force flag, the insignia, all that was just a swastika. And they didn't see anything wrong with that for a long time. So.
Wow. How did they get away with it? It's insane.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, especially because Finland and Germany had some like, interesting shared history in World War II. I mean, they were both against the USSR and kind of became, unlikely friends that way. I don't know if it started there, but it ended way more recently than you'd think.
I've been fortunate that I've never seen the Nazi flag flying here. I've seen it on TV at rallies for Ron DeSantis as an example. And for those who don't know, he's the governor of Florida who's running for the presidential nomination. And there were people who espoused to the Nazi ideals who were in his campaign who, once that was discovered, they were thrown out. But I think it was more just because it embarrassed them. But anyway, what I have seen is a lot of graffiti with the swastika, or whether it's spray paint, whether it's carving in stone. After the 2016 election here in the United States, the presidential election, there was a lot of vandalism on synagogues, Jewish related organizations, schools, where the swastika was, painted and defacing tombstones, defacing buildings, you name it, all in the name of, white supremacy and evil. So, like I said, I've never seen the flag flying, and I hope that I never do. But unfortunately, I've seen what it symbolizes in a large quantity here.
Oh yeah. I was wondering too, just like to touch on, you said like there was Maori gangs that sometimes use it. I'm wondering if I hesitate to even like ask, but like, so the Tino Rangatiratanga and it share a color scheme, and I'm wondering if that has anything to do with it. There are not too many flags nowadays that are red, white, and black, even though it's in my opinion, a very visually appealing color scheme. I love the Tino Rangatiratanga, but I wonder if that like has anything to do with it.
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
Those colours are very important to Māori culture, and it's completely different. And that was designed by Māori people that are very spiritual and absolutely very separate. The mongrel mob is about something else completely.
The mongrel mob is all about drugs, crime, against the grain, and that's their
anti-government
way of life. And they're like, it's all about drugs and crime, like seriously, and a place to belong for those who have nowhere to go. But that's the ticket to getting into the gang, and they prey on people who have no whānau family, and they feel like they have a place to belong, but ultimately it leads to a life in jail, and it's we won't touch on the gangs too much, but it is interesting that the swastika is used by a brown-skinned gang, and they don't necessarily fly it as their colours like outside, like they're very much mongrel mob, that's their thing, but it's in their clubhouses, which I found extremely interesting. When we first discovered this.
But it's pretty sad, isn't it, when you look back at the original meaning of it, and something that was pure and good has been used so that it's tarnished. It's tarnished it for everybody. And it's like, my flag, my English flag, it's used by white supremacists, and then it just gets tarnished. And it's something I associate with that now rather than my country, and it's just ruined my flag. So it's pretty sad.
Just to add on that, Tracy, then, so I was Googling, is it legal to fly the Nazi flag in the UK? And the fifth item it shows me is, where was it? Sixth one, sorry, is that somebody's flying the England flag. Is that legal in the UK?
There you go.
There you are. Sort of the other interesting point, because I think wider afield, is that how many, let's put it as it is, how many far-right groups and splinter anti-government groups use the Nazi flag as their own symbol? Do they actually really fully appreciate, wrong word, understand, its true meaning, or are they just using the first thing that they know will get people's backs up?
Yeah,
I think that's it.
It's that. It's to, wind people up. It's a jibe. It's hate. It means hate. They don't.
it is the most, in my opinion, the most recognized symbol throughout the world that says evil, hate, anti the grain, it is. And it's so striking, like Andy said, it is so striking. Yeah, and even the way that it was designed, how it's flipped on a different angle, and the color scheme of it being black on white with the red, it it is visually very striking, but it actually to me says evil. Like it actually does.
It's just used as an insult, isn't it? It's like
Yeah.
down the road there's a campaign for the Labour candidates, and somebody has put the swastika on both of their heads.
Yeah.
Just,
someone's drawn it on.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's just everyone knows that that's what. I mean, I guess Hitler knew what he was doing when he designed it because he was an artist, wasn't he? But he knew it would be striking.
I was going to say, I'll give you a perfect example of, yes, the people know what they're doing. And since we can talk politics, the filter comes off.
Damn right.
January 6, 2021, when we had a coup attempt in America to prevent the transfer of power from Donald Trump to Joe Biden, the Nazi flag per se was not there that I saw. But what I did see from people who were rioting and storming the Capitol, one gentleman had a T-shirt with a swastika on it that said Camp Auschwitz. Another one had a T-shirt with a swastika on it that said 6 million was not enough, referring to the Jews who were killed in concentration camps. So absolutely anybody who dons that symbol, today's point is it is the most recognizable symbol of evil that at least we in the West know. They knew exactly what they're doing when they adopt that symbol in any form.
Yeah, here in the States, definitely.
I will say my first exposure, and Dave and Tracy, you were touching on how it had a very peaceful and benign meaning prior to the Nazis usurping it. When we were in the Baltics, I want to say it was in Latvia, we saw a store that was selling jewelry, and one of the intricately woven, patterns that was carved into the jewelry contained swastikas. And Andrew and I were kind of like, what is this? And our guide was telling us that this is not a symbol of Nazism. This was a symbol of peace and harmony and nature prior, for centuries, millennia prior to the Nazis taking it over. So it is still used to some degree for very benign purposes. But unfortunately, Tracy, I think you said earlier, in our lifetime, we're never going to get rid of that stigma. It's going to be centuries from now, if ever, that stigma goes away.
Yeah. Isn't it ironic that it was a symbol of peace that's been turned into a symbol of hate? Isn't that crazy? Like, could have taken any symbol, but no, it took one that was for peace, and flipped it on its head.
And Dave, to your point about the aesthetics of it, I guess, writ large, like it is like, if you ignore obviously the meaning, the history, all that behind it, it is a very aesthetically, I think you used the word striking. It's definitely that, like, if you remove everything from it, you could even call it beautiful. Obviously that's hard to do because it's hard to remove everything from it.
We agree with that sentiment too. But honestly, like, flag when you take the stigma out.
Yeah, I think like most of the, if not all the flags today, if you divorce them from the hateful stuff that they're, and hateful is putting it lightly, but the things that they're associated with, they are good design wise. Yes. Like, and yeah, like you said, striking.
You beat me to it.
Oh, sorry.
No, not at all. No, I agree with that 100%.
It's hateful people. I don't know. They're not bad at aesthetics, apparently.
Yeah, I know.
Gotta be good. But
isn't that why they work? That's why they work.
That is exactly
And the worldwide acknowledgement from people because they recognize it and it's such a simple design too. Like it is very less is more, isn't it? There's not a hell of a lot happening, but what's there is.
Well, apparently, if these hate groups had adopted the flags of Mali or Guinea, they wouldn't last at all because those flags suck.
One could mean peace, one could mean evil, and they'd probably get mixed up.
Yeah, there you go.
All right. Well, speaking of white supremacy, my flag is up next. We'll transfer from one white supremacist flag to another one. I'll be talking about the Confederate flag, but I have a couple of points I want to make before I start my discussion on this. So I'm going to talk about both the Confederate flag, what we know as the Confederate flag, and the flag of the Confederacy, being the Confederate States of America. They're not the same. but they have an interwoven history, and the latter played a big role in the development and prominent role of the former, to where we are today. For ease of conversation, I'm going to refer to the Confederate battle flag as the rebel flag. The taboo flag we're talking about is going to be the rebel flag. And when I say the flag of the Confederacy, that's going to be the flag of the Confederate States of America. So if you're asking yourself, what is the flag of the Confederacy? It's basically a horizontal triband of red, white, and red with a blue canton and a circle of, at the time it was created, 7 stars representing one of these, or each of the 7 states that were the first to secede from the Union. As more states seceded, they added more and more stars until ultimately they had 13 stars in a circle. So basically it would be if Austria and the Betsy Ross flag had a love child, that's what the flag of the Confederacy would look like. The states that originally seceded, you can see 4 of them behind me, the flags of those states: Mississippi, Georgia, Florida, what I jokingly call the Islamic Republic of South Carolina, because it's got a crescent moon on it just to piss off the Islamophobes in that state. The other 3 states being Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas. I didn't want to fly Louisiana because the Pelicans just creeps me out. Alabama's flag is plain, so I went with Florida instead. But regarding the flag of the Confederacy, it actually became a liability on the battlefield. When it was originally designed, they wanted to have it look sort of like the American flag because they were breaking off from America, but they wanted to keep some of those aesthetics. The problem was when you're seeing it from a distance, or perhaps more importantly, when you're seeing it hang limp on a pole because there's no wind, and limp is never a good thing, you can't necessarily differentiate between the American flag and the flag of the Confederacy. And for the first Battle of Bull Run, the Confederate soldiers could not distinguish between the two, and they were firing upon each other. So a lot of the Confederate leadership said, okay, this is going to be a problem. We need to have something else. So they adopted what was known at the time as the Confederate battle flag as a distinction. I'm going to call it the rebel flag from now on. So the rebel flag is basically, it's a red banner. It's got a blue saltire with white fimbriation, and there are a total of 13 stars in the blue saltire. Even when it is hanging limp, it is still very distinguishable from the American flag. So that was the whole purpose behind it. It was designed in 1861 by a gentleman named William Porcher Miles, who actually proposed it as the flag for the Confederate States of America, but the powers that be that were making that decision wanted to have a flag that looked more like the American flag, so they went with the earlier flag that I described. As time went on, people in the Confederacy did not care for the flag that they had adopted because it looked too much like the oppressive American flag that represented what they were trying to break away from. So they said, aha, we've got this rebel flag over here. Why not create a new flag that has that in it? So they, in their infinite wisdom, took a plain white flag, stuck the rebel flag on the fly or the hoist side of the flag, and called it a day. Unfortunately, it looks very much like the flag of surrender, especially when it's hanging limp. So the super geniuses realized, okay, this was a mistake. Let's fix it. So their idea to fix it was to put a red stripe down the fly side of the flag, which looked just as ugly, but at least it wasn't completely white. So that the flag of the Confederacy went through 3 different stages, the latter two having adopted the rebel flag. The rebel flag was first used in battle, flown by the Army of Northern Virginia, most famously under the command of Robert E. Lee. One thing that I discovered when doing research on this flag and the history behind it, including the Army of Northern Virginia, was that my great-great-grandfather served in the Army of Northern Virginia under General Lee. So I have a disturbingly not so distant relative who was actually in the first military unit that used that particular flag. So not necessarily part of that, but it just is what it is. It's an interesting fact of history. So, use that for what you will. So after the defeat of the Confederacy, the military defeat of the Confederacy during the Civil War, the rebel flag fell into relative obscurity. until Black Americans began being very vocal about their civil rights. In what I'm going to call a show of arrogance, the state of Mississippi incorporated the rebel flag into their state flag in 1894 in advance of a Supreme Court decision that they believed was going to be in their favor regarding the legalization of segregation, meaning that Black people and white people had to be separate in every respect, not just in schools, in all social life, you name it. And sure enough, 2 years later, that actually happened. And Mississippi kept that rebel flag as part of their flag design until 2021, when they adopted the Magnolia monstrosity that you see over here. It's actually not a bad flag. I just like calling it that, and it's certainly better than what they had. But even after they adopted it, it was still kind of on the down low. It wasn't very prominent. When the rebel flag really took off was in 1948, when an incredibly racist politician from South Carolina named Strom Thurmond ran for the presidency. He had been a Democrat, but I guess the Democratic Party wasn't racist enough for him, so he broke off, helped form what became known as the Dixiecrats. It's a political party that was a racist offshoot of the Democratic Party. Their fourth article of incorporation said, we quote, "We stand for segregation of the races." So he was running on that platform. Not just his campaign, but that party itself adopted many symbols of the Confederacy, particularly the rebel flag. So that is when segregation, white supremacy, the subjugation of Black people truly became interwoven with the rebel flag in the 20th century, is when it was adopted by the Dixiecrats, and it's never, gotten away from that. In 1954, when the Supreme Court did an about-face on segregation and ruled that it was unconstitutional, Georgia kind of followed in Mississippi's footsteps and said, "Fuck you," and adopted a new state flag that had the rebel flag incorporated into it. And they went through many different iterations of their flag until I believe it was 2003, when, under pressure from everybody who was not a racist asshole, Georgia finally had a referendum to change their flag to what you see behind me. Unfortunately, Georgia kind of got another fuck you to the general public in without most people realizing it, because what they did was adopt the flag of the Confederate States of America. They just put their seal right in the middle of the circle of 13 stars. So it is still a symbol of the Confederacy. It's just not the one that was most prominently used in the context of white supremacy and hate, at least in the 20th century. So, a lot of lawmakers in Georgia kind of saw it, or the Black lawmakers in particular, kind of saw it as a begrudgingly acceptable compromise, because at least it wasn't the one that had been used to oppress Black people, wasn't the one that was being used by the KKK, to intimidate Black people. But it still does have, strong undertones of the Confederacy. So, I guess give points Georgia for creativity and take points away from the American public for being a little ignorant as far as what the Confederate flag actually looked like. I grew up in North Carolina. I grew up around the rebel flag. I mean, when I say it was everywhere at the time in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, it really was everywhere. And it was something that we all grew up being very desensitized to, because you saw it in shirts, in hats, in shoes, in jewelry, patches that people would wear on their jackets. We had a popular TV show called The Dukes of Hazzard, which was set, I believe, in Georgia, which the two main characters had a car called the General Lee, a bright orange car that had a Confederate flag, detail on the roof of the car. Most people that, we grew up hearing that this was just a symbol of the South. It was Southern pride. It was nothing to do with anything else. And if you're a white person growing up in the South at that time, it makes sense, because you don't know the history. It's a completely different history for anybody who is Black growing up in the South. But when you get older and you dig into the history of the flag, and you realize how it has been used by political parties, by the Ku Klux Klan, by other hate groups to instill fear and intimidation and terror in Black Americans, you realize just how insidious this flag actually is, and how we had been conditioned growing up to just accept this as a flag of, this is just Southern pride. I actually asked two friends of mine from North Carolina in recent weeks, what's your view on the Confederate flag? There's no right or wrong answer. I just want to know your take on it. And they told me the exact same thing that I just told you now, that how we were just so accustomed to it. We were, for lack of a better word, indoctrinated into just believing this is Southern pride, because we were not ever taught the history, and it was branded everywhere. And I mean everywhere. What surprised me when I moved to Pennsylvania was, as soon as I crossed the border, I'm seeing Confederate flags, or excuse me, rebel flags on people's cars, either in the form of a license plate or decals on their cars. And my first thought was, okay, are you really from the South and you're just kind of up here? And I look at the license plate, and it's a Pennsylvania license plate. And I thought, what, you weren't part of the Confederacy. Why do you have this? And then after doing some digging into Pennsylvania, I realized we are home to a disturbingly high number of white supremacist groups, especially in this particular quadrant of Pennsylvania. And oftentimes it's younger people I see who've got this decal on their car, and I don't know if they're just ignorant or if they truly do understand what this has represented over time to Black people in this country, and how they've just adopted it as a symbol of hate. So it's unfortunate that this has happened. I'm seeing it surprisingly less and less in the South. When I go back home to North Carolina, I don't see it quite as often. One last footnote, before I open this up to everybody else, and I'll go back to January 6, 2021, when we had the coup attempt in our government. Even during the Civil War, the rebel flag had never been inside the U.S. Capitol outside of a historical display for educational purposes, a temporary display inside the Capitol. And on January 6th, one of the people who broke into the Capitol and assaulted police officers and tried to take over was carrying a gigantic Confederate flag on a pole. And when I saw that, on live TV, my first thought was I wanted to kill him, because here's this asshole flying a flag of what I'm going to call traitors, in our Capitol. And the second part of me just wanted to throw up, because this had never happened before in our history, and now it was happening on live TV, and it was just absolutely disgusting. So, again, it's still a battle to get a lot of people to understand that it is a symbol of white supremacy. It is a symbol of hate. It is not a symbol of Southern heritage. But I think that that's just one of those things that's going to have to be, addressed continually over time until people are stopped being indoctrinated into it.
Wow.
Yep.
There was going to the heritage comment. There was a survey in 2019 in America, and 34% of people felt it symbolized heritage, versus 41% that thought it symbolized racism. But I guess even heritage, it's like, but what is that heritage?
What's the heritage?
Yeah.
It's all very problematic and caught up. Like, a lot of those people, like, that you're talking about, they'll say like their tagline is heritage, not hate. And it's like, okay, but like you said, heritage of what? And their other argument is, oh, it was for states' rights. And it's okay, states' rights to do what? Like, states' rights to do what, though? And if you dig, even like an inch deep, you'll find exactly what you think you find. But
it's interesting. I'm actually quite surprised that percentage isn't higher, Tracy, who viewed it as heritage. When I first left North Carolina and went to school to college in California, I used to not so jokingly tell people that the Civil War never ended. And they said, what do you mean it ended? Of course it ended in 1865. I said, the military conflict ended. The Civil War, the underlying reason for it, did not ever end. It's still there. I grew up with people who referred to the Civil War as the War of Northern Aggression, or the War for Southern Independence, and they still do. They still refer to anybody who was, born north of Virginia as a Yankee. You look at some of the systemic racism, that has come from that region, that's been, spread out throughout our country, whether it is voting laws where Black people were given these bullshit competency tests in order to be able to vote. And the tests were worded in such a way, the questions were worded in such a way that nobody could pass them. I mean, I read some of these tests, they're impossible to pass, and they were designed that way for a reason. You look at what were successful, thriving Black neighborhoods, the government would seize them through eminent domain and build an interstate. And then you've got people who are now housed in, a much less desirable area if their houses were destroyed, if their businesses were destroyed, and the people who remain are now living beside a freeway and breathing in all those fumes. So, unfortunately, those underlying reasons why we had this war to begin with, they're still here. And that's why I'm actually quite surprised that, you don't have a higher percentage of people embracing that flag for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah, we watched a documentary about the history of the rebel flag sort of a little while ago, which was kind of what spawned the idea for this podcast for me, because I wanted to know more about it. And thank you so much for all the information you just shared, Joe. That was like riveting, honestly. That was really good. And they were going around interviewing people, like the guy who was presenting it was just going up to random people in the southern states, like Tennessee, Mississippi, and they're like, what does this symbol mean to you? What does this flag mean to you? He's like, oh, that's just my heritage. We're talking like average, everyday soccer mums, like dressed nice, on their way to work, and they're just like, what does this mean to you? Oh, that's like my family's history, and like that's that, whereas the other people are like, with the accent and all, like, oh, I hate black people, and that's like a lot of that was down there, and it was like, wow. But then, interestingly, I asked a few guys at work because they know we're into flags. And as soon as they got to know me at work, so I started my new job only this year in Darfield. And they were asking me, have you got a Confederate flag in your collection? And I was like, interesting question. I said, why is that? And I said, what do you guys think it means? And one guy who's just like listening on the periphery, he's just going, oh, that's the flag from Dukes of Hazzards. And everyone just thinks it's the flag of the Dukes of Hazzards. They have no idea what it actually represents. And I actually gave them a bit of a lesson in what the flag means and why you shouldn't fly it, because that same guy, he's like, oh, that's the flag of the Rebels gang in New Zealand. They're a bikie gang. That's their symbol on the back of their patch is the Rebel flag, and that's their name. And I was just like, yeah. And they're a predominantly white gang, obviously. So again, it's a symbol of white supremacy and hate, and people are not aware of this, especially in countries like New Zealand who don't have the history like Americans might have. We don't know as much over here.
And let's face it, like when we first really got into flags, if you'd have put that flag in front of me, and most people know that I love red, white, and blue flags, and looking at that purely from a design point of view, it's just my flag.
It pops,
it would be.
It pops.
And I didn't know what it meant at all.
No.
And it's, when I look at some of the other flags, like Tennessee as well, that's another flag that, I really liked, but now I realize it's got all the ingredients of the Confederate flag, and it's subtly racist, and now I've got that knowledge now, but just from a visual point of view, they are very striking.
Yes, like other flags, Arkansas, and as you said, Joey, Georgia, they've like pulled a fast one over everybody there. But yeah, Arkansas, when you look at that, you instantly go, oh, that looks surprisingly rebel flag like. I just feel like it's all subtle racism still hidden in all of these flags, and particularly from these states that were part of the Confederacy.
Although these days it's not so subtle, at least as far as the rebel flag goes. I mean, you go to any Trump rally, you're going to see that flag in abundance.
Yeah.
And I think to Tracy's earlier point about the UK flag being usurped for all the wrong reasons, I'm sure Andy would agree with me on this one. We've seen the same with the American flag in this country, and I think that goes back to 9/11, and I won't go into this too much, but even as a military veteran, having put my life on the line for what this flag is supposed to represent, I am still very conflicted when I see the American flag, because it's very prominently featured at all these rallies where you've got people, these Trump crazies who want to put a crazy dictator in power, who wants to take away our rights, who wants to kill democracy, who wants to basically stay in office so he can stay out of jail. And it's just, it's hard for me to look at my own country's flag and not see what they are making it represent. And it's a struggle for me every day to step back from that and say, we have to take this back. This is all of our flags. It is not their proprietary flag. It belongs to all of us. We have to take this back. And it's something I am still struggling to do.
Yeah, it's hard. It's very like jingoistic. Like if I see, I drive by a house that has an American flag out, they could be just, doing that because they think that's just what they're supposed to do, or they could be doing that because they're very right wing. If I see there's a guy that lives down the street from me who, on the rare occasion that his garage door is open, he's got a big American flag on the wall and then a big Trump flag on the wall, and I know exactly what that guy's politics are. I mean, even aside from the Trump flag, I think the American flag in the garage, like, it's like I'm doing America in here. Like, leave me alone. I don't know. It's
I get
interesting.
it. I get it. It'd be like if you raised your garage up and you saw someone with a Nazi, a Confederate, a rising sun. Like you'd just be like, oh, I think there's a little bit of hate going on.
Keep driving, keep moving. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was gonna say to your point about the Arkansas flag, like it's got the diamond, the lozenge, if you want, and a rhombus maybe even. And it's got 4 stars in the central part, not counting the ones that outline it. And the top star, there's 3 at the bottom, 1 over the word Arkansas, and the one over the word Arkansas literally represents the Confederacy. Like that is what that star represents. Right. The other 3, I think, are like the US and maybe Spain and France, because they've variously controlled that region. But yeah, but they made sure to note that the top one, the one above all the other ones, is for the Confederacy. It's like, leave it off or don't make the distinction, other than, if you have a reason, and it seems like you do.
Because the Civil War never ended.
Yeah. That's why I put that one in Georgia more in the Confederate trash folder than some of the others.
I like that, though. That was funny.
From my side, I think, and just touching what you were saying earlier, Tracy, that I mean, I grew up, as we've already covered, watching Dukes of Hazzard on the Saturday evening, and being obviously very, very, very young at that time when it was on, and therefore having no knowledge of what it meant, what it represents, being in the Britain, it was never covered. We never covered it at school. All that part of American history. I've never touched it from during a UK educational point. It was just we were too busy covering the Romans and what happened in Germany in the 1940s. But so that sort of thing never comes up. And in fact, when I went through the education system, racism and that part was rarely touched on, if at all the way through my schooling days. And again, it's no wonder that why people seem to think that it's a heritage thing as opposed to what it's actually representing. And it is a shame, and that's putting it very lightly, that it's not just America that learns these types of lessons or relearns the history of what actually happened, but it does need to go wider. And this, I suppose this goes back to a point, Dave, why you wanted this in the first place, is that we need to be covering these subjects more vocally. So we're not forgetting these sorts of the lessons. I'm not trying to dumb it down at all, actually, because these lessons are really harsh and horrific in all of the flags that we're covering. But yeah, things like segregation and racism, how is it still a thing in the 21st century? I still don't know to this day, but that's just me. And I suppose a good part of it is because we're just not educated about it. Whatever part of the world we're from, it's just not there in the curriculums, and that's the scary thing.
And we now have a push in our schools in certain states here to to whitewash it and to specifically ban anything that's negative about white people.
Yeah.
And it was a history, or no history. In Florida, they're trying to teach in history classes that slavery was beneficial to the slaves. They learned a lot of good skills being enslaved.
It's the mental gymnastics are not surprising when you think about the folks doing them, but it's still,
it's appalling.
Yeah.
I remember, I'll shut up after this, I promise, but I remember growing up in Fayetteville, North Carolina. There was our main street was a street called Rayford Road, and there was a restaurant that we never frequented at all. I remember, we always drove past it, and there was a big sign in the window that said "No coloreds," which is the derogatory term for Black people that the person who owned this restaurant was using. And it used to piss my dad off every time we drove past it. And, to his credit, we didn't always get along, but he abhorred racists. He hated them. And we were never, ever going to go in that restaurant. We never did. And I thought, one day, when we get past, the 1970s, the 1980s, this is going to be a thing of the past. We're never going to see this again. And that's what I thought would be my reality now. And I could not have been more wrong. The one good thing I will have to say that came out of the Trump presidency is that it ripped off the veneer of we've made a lot of advancements, because we haven't. It was window dressing, and that shit was always there underneath the surface. He just gave it permission to come back up, and there it is. So now we know what we have to fight against, starting with education, to your point, Tareth.
Yeah.
It's pretty shocking, isn't it, really? Because I consider New Zealand and as being more backwards compared to America. Yet I feel that we're moving forward. We're inclusive. We don't really stand for racism here.
Not at all.
And America just seems to be going backwards. Yet we all look to America to be,
the land of the free. The good guys, the world police.
We've been on the downswing for a while now, I think.
Like when you see, like in New Zealand, you can have legal abortion, you can get married if you're gay, you can be who you want, you can do what you want, you can be a member of any religious party, group, society with no fear of being arrested, anything. You can. In America, like what we see, and it all ties in with this, I imagine, with Republicans, is all your rights being taken away. Like, I don't get it. And going backwards. And even slavery, and I don't mean to get religious, but because this is one of those topics, there's like slavery in the Bible where it tells you how to look after and treat your slaves. And these politicians who stand for these flags, the Confederacy, use the Bible and the laws, the old laws of the Bible, for their politics, and it's all connected, and it is wrong. And I just think something needs to change. Like, democracy needs to take hold of this, and until that happens, I think America's in big trouble. But racism's huge. On that same documentary I mentioned before, I was so appalled with the leader of a white power gang in Mississippi, like Ku Klux Klan. He was a leader. They had the rebel flag. His opinion about Black people was that they are animals and white people were created by God and Black people weren't, and that they evolved from animals and white people didn't. I was like, where's this thought pattern coming from? Like, what is teaching him this? And it's from generations of hate, and that spawns all the way back to the Confederacy, and it's so shocking when I learned about this. And these are people attached to this flag. This is another reason why you cannot fly this flag. I think it's wrong.
Oh, I lied. I have another story for you. When I was a senior in high school, I went over to my friend Tina's house to study calculus. And her brother was several years older than she was. And he was at home at the time and loved himself the Confederate flag, the rebel flag. And I remember being in the kitchen talking to her mom, and I just heard him say, "I wish I had a machine gun so I could kill that bitch." And I poked my head in there. I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And I'm looking at the TV, and he's watching a video on MTV when MTV used to play music. And it's a Jody Watley video. I'm like, "What did Jody Watley ever do to you? Like, for you to say that?" And his comment back to me was, and I will not repeat it verbatim, but he said, "She is a," and then he used the N-word. I'm like, wow. It's one of the few times in my life I've actually been speechless. I'm like, how do you have that twisted and sick of an ideology that you want someone dead just because they are a different color? And this is
his parents probably
did. This is what your flag. Her parents were quite racist too. She was not. I don't know what shielded her. It's like, Wonder Woman with the bracelets, boom, boom.
No, yeah, that's true. I guess they're brother and sister. Yeah, that's a harder
But the rest
argument,
of them, good God. And they all love that flag.
That's crazy. It's just like it's evil. It's simple as that. And the more you see it, the more you're around it, the more you believe it, and that's how brainwashing works. And it's as simple as that. Yeah,
because Jesus obviously was a white European Christian as opposed to a Jewish Middle Eastern.
We've all seen the paintings.
Yeah,
I know.
Oh well.
Not to mention he probably did CrossFit because he's ripped too.
He's got the abs,
right?
Yeah, and it's no coincidence that 3 of the 4 flags behind me have "In God We Trust."
Yes, it's very impressive.
I'll leave it at that.
Yeah,
it's not.
Yeah, we could blow the lid off this otherwise.
On to Tareth.
Yes.
Right, great chat.
Moving segue then. Okay. So I'm covering from one to another, the Japanese rising sun flag, and I'll call it the rising sun, which is what it alludes to. So this is, if you picture the Japanese national flag as I have today, but with 16 red and white rays, and the sun just off to the left towards the hoist. And this is the flag that we're specifically talking about. So that's the Japanese rising sun. But it was first used, though, we need to go back to the 1600s, which is when it first originated from. But the first version was with the sun centered, exactly like the main Japanese national flag. And that version with the sun rays was adopted by the Imperial Japanese Army. But that's not the one we're talking about. The one we're talking about, as I say, is the one to the left, which appeared first in 1889 properly and was adopted by the Navy signs of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And both flags were in use for both the Japanese Army and the Navy for quite some time, obviously right up until the end of the Second World War in 1945, when both flags were retired and stopped. Now, in 1954, the newly named, and I love these, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, the Navy, basically reintroduced their original flag, but completely different because they changed the shade of red ever so slightly, and that was their get-out clause of it wasn't the same original flag. The army, however, didn't reuse, which was the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force Army. They used a completely different flag to what they originally had. So yeah, it's this off-center version that we're talking about, and the reason it's linked to it's been branded with, especially in the Asian world, is because of the wartime atrocities that countries such as Korea, China, Philippines, and a lot of other Asian countries experienced under the hands of Japan under that original naval flag. And that's hence why the connotations even today is a big push in that part of the world. But what I found interesting with this flag, which makes it slightly different to the others that we've talked about so far, is that there seems to be this gap, unless history is wiped a lot, where there's not much pushback on this Japanese flag until it really kicks off in 2012. So really recent, when a group in New York, a group of Koreans in New York, under the banner of the Citizens Against War Crimes Symbols, started really pushing that the Japanese rising sun flag should be banned because of what it was linked to and how their country in the past was dealt with during the wars and previously. They had a banner that appeared again in 2013 as part of an East Asian Cup, which promoted the issue even more. So then it started to really get a lot more traction at this point that, yes, this is a flag that shouldn't really be widely used. And there was a professor, Koichi Nakoni, of the Sophia University in Tokyo, who suggested that the rising sun flag at this time was more comparable to the Confederacy flag or banner, when trying to put it into context of what this flag had meaning to a lot of the Asian world outside Japan. It was eventually banned by FIFA, the International Football Association, in 2017 after it appeared, apparently, at that time. And then 2018, this was an interesting read that I found. So in 2018, there was a big, I don't know what you want to call it. It was almost like the local countries around, well, anybody who had an international navy basically goes and shows off all their fleet. But in 2018, it happened to be in South Korea where they had this big thing. But the interesting point was that South Korea had never objected to Japan flying this flag when they had this big show your boats off type of thing. One being in 1998, and then again in 2008, it was the Japanese Navy were flying their rising sun flag, no issues at all. But come 2018, that's when South Korea really kicks off about this, and with their aim specifically at Japan not to fly this rising sun flag, and because they were hosting this international fleet review, dictated that any country that was joining into this this review had to fly their national flags on their navies, not the navy flags, of which a lot of countries agreed and went no problem at all, except Japan, the one country it was really aimed at, who insisted that no, their rising sun flag was their naval flag, and their navy ships will only ever fly that flag, and therefore they actually pulled out of the exercise in the end. Wow. And then in 2020, there was a big hoo-ha about the flag appearing in the Tokyo Olympics, which, of course, as we know, took part in 2021 because of the pandemic. And the reason for the pandemic obviously had no audience, just the participants. That's all. So South Korea took that as a win. That after putting their complaint to the IOC, the International Olympics Committee, saying you should ban this rising sun flag at the Olympics, of which the IOC were going, well, we'll take each case by case. But because at the end of Tokyo 2020, the rising sun flag never appeared, probably because nobody was sitting in the audience. But anyway, they took that as a win and did a big hoo-ha about, see, the IOC were on our side, they banned the flag, and we got through that peacefully until the IOC went, well, no, we didn't ban it. We just said that we'd look at each case by case. But anyway, I that's not trying to dumb down South Korea, because I totally get where they were coming from and how they were dealt with. But it just goes to the point of, again, like previous flags that we've already talked about, the meaning and the symbolism of what that flag meant to South Korea and many other Asian countries, and what that meant for them. So a couple of points just to finish on this bit was that so it had devastating meaning in many Asian countries, especially during its association with World War II. That's the big thing. However, unlike the Nazi flag that we've already spoken about, this wasn't designed specifically for the reason of what it's known for today. This was designed, almost a couple hundred years ago, purely as a navy flag. It's just that its connotations today is very different to what it was. I talked about the US Confederate links that it's been associated with in part, but obviously from Japan's perspective, the flag itself, as I said, it's very much steeped in its own naval history. And I suppose the question would be, should Japan drop the rising sun flag because of its associations, or because they've got all this history that sits behind it of their navy? Should they continue, which I'm thinking they're going to anyway, because they would have dropped it by now if they were going to, keep it as it is? So I think it's a different connotation, although the underlyings of it, of how different nations were treated under this flag, just like they were with other flags that we already talked about. But it's just interesting that the flag was there for a very different reason, which for me is the interesting point on this one.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it being the only one out of our four, or I've got multiples, but they follow a theme. But yeah, that wasn't specifically created like for the time and place that it was used, I guess, more or less. I had not thought about that. And I do agree with you. Just I'll keep this short, but yeah, I agree with you. I don't think that's it's going anywhere anytime soon. So
No.
Yeah, you can kind of say that about a lot of flags. You could say it about the Union Jack because you know that does up. You know, look at what happened under that. So I can kind of see where they're coming from, but at the same time, it was pretty horrific. It's
Well,
different.
the Japanese were quite barbaric
Exactly.
in some of the war crimes they committed. So if I was to have an opinion on the Navy using the flag or not, I think out of respect to the rest of the world and the countries in particular that were affected, China, South Korea, the Philippines, and a lot of those, you know, Southeast Asia countries during the war, like the atrocities they committed they were bad. And I think it's almost a smack in the face to those countries that their navy, of all places to fly, you know, that was part of the war. Like, why do they get away with using it when clearly as a country they dropped it and they stick with just the current, you know, Japanese flag? Wouldn't that be far more respectful, especially for a country that kind of goes under the radar in terms of Germany takes the rap for World War II, and rightly so. But I would say Italy and Japan do not take as much heat as Germany did. Whereas they should. I think they should. And I think out of respect, they should just be like, yeah, no, you're kind of right there. We probably shouldn't fly it, you know. And that's just where I stand on it. But again, it's another gorgeous design. I understand. It's just one of those ones. But because it was previously in use before the atrocities of World War II, it is a sticky wicket, you know.
We made the mistake of flying it because we just thought it was the historical flag, and we had no idea.
No.
We were very new to flags, and you know,
I just thought it was cool.
Yeah, and then we got lots of comments, and you know, we sort of defended it for a couple of days, like, oh, it's just a historical flag, and then you know, we delved deeper and educated ourselves, and then it's like, okay, that is not coming out again. But it's just ignorance. We don't know. We're not educated on.
That's it.
On it.
Education is huge.
Yeah,
this is why this video is a good idea. You know.
Yeah, I mean that, and like we've touched on a couple times now, it is very visually striking. Like I understand wanting to own it. Like I didn't know a lot of that really until I guess like some of it until you guys had like, I don't know if it was a video or a post or what, but you guys did talk about that little like, you know, dust up or what, and not even like, where you were like, oops, maybe we shouldn't fly this anymore. I know you guys addressed that, and that's when I looked it up more. And I was like, oh yeah, it is. I knew it wasn't great, but yeah, worse than I thought, especially in like the Philippines and a lot of areas around there that, but you could be forgiven. I mean, definitely forgiven for thinking otherwise.
Yeah, my friend's Indonesian, our friend, and she's very offended by that flag.
Yeah, she saw it in our collection when she was visiting us. She's like, oh, you've got that flag. And like, yeah, just for the record, we bought it before we knew about the historical content of that flag. And she's like, oh, like, she said if like you ever saw that in China, like they'd be so offended, like deeply offended, so because of the things that happened. So yeah, we learned a lot about that. We did a video, Ultimate Flag Fails, where we got people to send us their stories of
that's what
Ultimate Flag Fails, and that was our contribution to it. You know?
Yeah, that's the one I remember seeing. Yeah.
I going back to your earlier point, Dave, about and we touched on about whether they should still be using it, and I agree. I think yes, almost out of respect, as regardless of the design, of which, you know, I don't think anybody taking the design as itself is going to say it's bad flag in any respect. However, what it represents and what it has shown, I don't understand why the army or the ground force, whatever it's called now, has come up. If you look at that, the design of that, which is it's not a good design. It's got Japanese connotations behind it with the rising sun. It's still there, but it's very different. And I must admit, when I was looking into this, I was thinking that there's no reason why the Navy couldn't do exactly what it did previously and take the same design as the Army, shift the circle to the left slightly towards the hoist, and hey presto, you've got this Union flag with the ground force as well as you as the Navy, and you've dropped the whole connotation of what your previous flag was all about. So you can go and join and show off all your big boats with the other local neighbours, whatever floats your boat, and that was a pun intended. Why that's not a thing, I don't know, because if the Army can drop it, why couldn't the Navy?
Yeah, I'm just stunned that the Navy still uses it. I'm just shocked how they somehow get away with it.
Yeah.
It'd be like the German Army using the swastika on their naval fleet now. Like, it's the equivalent of, in my opinion, it is. And you just wouldn't do that. You just wouldn't. You need to take some ownership of what happened, and it's offensive to people, and somehow Japan gets away with it. Not quite sure how, but they do.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, I don't think it would be quite as bad if the flags were the other way round, as in the Army had kept their rising sun, and the Navy, which obviously goes around the globe, showing off their flag everywhere, had this new design, because at least the ground force is all about defense of Japan, and therefore they're not really sending their troops anywhere to go. So you'd sort of go, well, it's on mainland Japan, it doesn't matter because it's their flag. But yeah, to have it flying around the world.
That's a good point. But yeah, annoyingly, another great looking flag that can't fly. But it is taboo. It's definitely in the taboo lane. You just can't do it. We did once, so that was it.
All right, cool. So you guys will never guess what flag I have.
Angola.
If you're on audio, you might not, but video, you'll probably guess. It is the Hammer and Sickle. I focused mostly on the USSR flag, of course, because it is when you think of a Hammer and Sickle flag, it is probably the one that you think of. I didn't really write up as much as you guys had. My show tends to be more discussion based, so I guess I was coming in that mindset. But I do have a good bit to say about the breakdown of the symbols and everything. So from what I could look up, the hammer came first, at least in the Soviet sense, the Soviet Union, as a symbol of industrial workers. The hammer, industrial workers, you can understand that. Originally, sources disagree, which I don't know, it was only early 20th century, so it seems like sources should agree more on this, but it was originally a plow instead of a sickle to represent like the agrarian, like peasant workers. And they kind of came up with a couple ways to cross a hammer and a plow, and just like visually, aesthetically, which like we've been talking about, it didn't really work. So they came up with the sickle, or more likely they appropriated it from somewhere else, because there is a hammer and a sickle on, where was it? Chile, on the Chilean peso coin from 1894, which you may recognize as like not too long after the Communist Manifesto is written. I think that's 1880s, but obviously before 1917 when the Russian Revolution is. So it's an existing symbol, and it meant on the Chilean coin what it meant to the Soviet Union: industrial workers, agrarian workers, united. So that one is kind of easy enough, but I think it's really interesting to point out the red star, which a lot of folks don't even see as a red star. They see it as a yellow outlined star. But what it's supposed to look like is a red star overlaid onto a slightly larger gold star. So it is a red star, not just like a negative space kind of thing. And it was supposed to symbolize the ultimate triumph of the ideas of communism on the 5 inhabited continents. 5 inhabited continents, I guess like Eurasia is one, and then the Americas and Africa. Or maybe the Americas are one, Europe, Asia, and Africa. I don't know. Oceania. Yeah. Sorry to forget you guys. You're on there too. But everything except.
Shame on you.
We're not even on the map.
Yeah. But yeah, so it was supposed to be a 5-pointed star for the 5, inhabited continents. It was also called the Mars star, not a Mars bar, but the Mars star, because it was, like a symbol of war, of Mars, like the god of war, the Roman god of war. And that's why, like, I think the red star, even in my research, the red star actually predates the hammer and sickle on a lot of Soviet symbolism and like insignias and things like that. The Red Army, for the longest time, actually, I think even during the war, they mostly had a red star on their hats, on their ushankas or whatever these that they were wearing, more so than they would have any of the hammer and sickle symbolism. But when you combine the two, you get a pretty striking image, in my opinion. I wouldn't probably have all these if not for that and a couple projects I've been working on. But yeah, I think it's instantly recognizable. And the Soviets did something that none of the other flags we've talked about today, other than like maybe like Joey's, where he talked about like the second battle flag or the second flag that had the red stripe and had the battle flag in Canton. The Soviets did something unlike all those, where they had constituent republics and they wanted them to be more or less uniform in their flags. So I read this book, and Tereth has this book as well, called what is it? Symbols in Service to the State, Flags and Other Symbols, and Soviet Civil Religion. And that like civil religion part is really focused on in this book. I wanted to read a brief quote from it, but okay, yeah, I got it highlighted here. It says, "It is important to remember that the purpose of Soviet civil religion was not just to instill a sense of patriotism or to prescribe a uniform standard of patriotic culture for the citizens of the USSR. More importantly, it was meant to create a unified sense of Sovietness among people from many different ethnic, linguistic, and religious groups distributed across a vast territory." So it's a very like pluralistic, well, multinational society, like union that they have. But they contrasted with America, where we have all of our states, but we are it's all one country. They wanted to be seen outwardly anyway as a little different than that. So all the SSRs, the republics, had different flags, but they're all variations on a theme. In some cases, they allowed them to keep national symbols, like this one of Belarus I've got here. If viewers can see it. It's similar to today's flag of Belarus. The white and red along the hoist side design are reversed now. The green's a slightly different shade, but that's not super important. But other than that, they let Belarus, White Russia, Little Russia, and a lot of Russian folklore, things like that, keep a lot more than they let like Ukraine, for example. Ukraine, they were trying to kind of rein in a little more. The Baltics, Joey, I'm sure you know this. The Baltics, out of everyone that didn't want to be an SSR, the Baltics wanted it the least, I think. So for the Baltics, they were like, hey, you're next to water. You get a little flowy water design. You're also next to water. You get a slightly different flowy water design. And they kept it pretty boring like that. So I just think it's very interesting to focus on the fact that it's very striking. It stands out a lot, but it's the only one out of the ones we've talked about that has like multiple iterations on the same thing, which I find fascinating. You always have like in any kind of like Soviet postcards, socialist realism art, like it's more like propaganda, I guess, but anytime you have all the flags of all the republics, you always have the USSR one at top, but you don't necessarily have the Russian SSR one directly underneath it. Sometimes the Russian one's halfway down and Belarus or Georgia or something is closer to the top. They jumble the order a bit, but the USSR one is always at the top. And yeah, I just think that's interesting. It's also, like I said, iterations. I've got behind me, the viewers can see the flag of Angola in Africa, which you may recognize is pretty far from the USSR, but it has a very similar symbol. It's meant to evoke it anyway. It's not a hammer and sickle. It is a sword and like half of a cog wheel. But the cog wheel obviously is for the same thing the hammer is for, industrial workers. And the sword, obviously, in this case, is a little bit, I don't know if it has a farm meaning like the scythe does, or if it's meant more in a violent revolutionary way kind of thing, because it tends to be. And interestingly enough, Lenin, when he was coming up with they held like a contest, if you can believe it, to like come up with design a crest for the Soviet Union. And a lot of the early designs, even once they started whittling down, had a hammer, a sickle, and a sword directly in the middle. But Lenin didn't like that. He said it was too violent. He wanted to just concentrate on the, the workers of the world unite. He wanted to concentrate on that part and leave the militarism out of it. The funny part being, of course, that there is included a red star, which was the militarism part directly above it, albeit smaller. And yeah, that's most of what I have on the. Oh, I did want to say the red was an obvious choice. The red flag comes from the Paris Commune in the I'm gonna get the year wrong, even as a French major. There's so many different like French revolutionary periods, but it's mid 1800s, I want to say, is the Paris Commune. 1840s, I'm not sure, somewhere in there. And they carried a red flag. I think because I can't remember exactly, but I know the flag of Paris is half blue, half red. For whatever reason, they wanted the red side. That's the side that they carried, and it became like inextricably linked to the Paris Commune, and that's where we get the word communist, is those from a commune in a commune. So it was kind of a 1-to-1 on the Soviets' part. Like, okay, the red color has been used in similar minded organizations for, decades, like almost a century. Well, 50, 60, 70 years at this point. So that's going to be the base. We'll put the rest in gold, and then we're done.
Vive la commune.
Yeah, there you go. Vive la commune. But yeah, do you guys like, what are your all's thoughts on this one? I will say, like, I know I just asked you, but I wouldn't own so many of these if I thought they were as offensive as the ones that you guys covered. That said, I do recognize, and I don't want it to go unsaid, that the death toll under this flag is catastrophically, it's enormous as well. I don't want to like, whitewash that or anything. That said, it's just at least, well, maybe not here in the South as much, but it's definitely more socially acceptable to have one of these than it is a swastika.
I think you and Dave both hit on great points when Dave talked about how does Japan get away with this rising sun flag for the Navy. The USSR flag is a little bit more acceptable than the rest of them. As a kid growing up during the Cold War, I viewed this as the flag of the enemy. And it was basically just that simple, the flag of the enemy, not realizing the history of it. It's when I went to the Baltics and talked to people in Estonia, in Latvia, in Lithuania, and did research on what happened during World War II, you start to realize very quickly that the Soviet Union, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, they're not that different at all.
Nope.
We in the West are taught all about what Nazi Germany did. The concentration camps, the ghettos, the mass murders. We're not taught what Japan did. We're not taught what the Soviet Union did, not just during World War II, to the Baltics, to Ukraine, to Belarus, to, the Caucasus, to Korea, or even in the 50-year occupation afterwards.
We're taught it in like broad strokes, but not as specifically. Yeah.
I mean, I would challenge you to talk to anybody in the Baltics and see how they view that flag. I would be surprised if they didn't view it the same as Nazi Germany, how we view Nazi Germany. I remember there was, I can't remember if it was Nike or Under Armour or somebody, one of these stupid companies had shirts and tank tops that were branded as basically the Soviet flag. And they didn't think anything of it because we're not taught the history behind what they did to these countries. Yeah. And many people I know in the Baltics were just up in arms, like how can you, a major company that should know better, adopt this symbol of terror and mass murder and just use it like it's nothing? Would you do this with the Nazi flag? No. So why are you doing with this? So I think it's all a matter of perspective of where you are in the world, how you're viewing these flags. In the West, we have this tiered structure where Nazi Germany is the ultimate evil, but guess what? To a lot of people, it's the Soviet flag. To other people, it's the Japanese rising sun flag. So yeah.
Even like among like former SSRs, it's different because like you and I both have said at this point, like, yeah, the Baltics really fought to not be part of the Soviet Union, like really did not want to be there. But some of the like Central Asian, like the stands, if you will, they still use Soviet imagery in their like state signals or state symbols. I have like where is it? I think so Belarus still uses it. I know that's not one of the stands. And then I've got Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. If you look at their like national I guess coats of arms, It's the exact same thing. They've removed the hammer and sickle barely, but they've kept everything else. It's very reminiscent. It's very like, you know what you're supposed to be looking at kind of thing. And to the point where even Transnistria, that is a break off from not really recognized republic off of Moldova, uses the same flag with like a minor variation on the colors or something, the same flag that the SSR of Moldavia used in the Soviet Union.
Yep.
So they've still got it on there, even though they're not communist. It just like it, you know, so yeah, it has like I guess it depends on like the Baltics. Yeah, communism definitely like flattened them, just like absolutely no ifs, ands, or buts. Some of the stands, like, I don't know, at least the way that they view it is that the Soviets came in and modernized things. So they have a much different kind of view on that, I guess. I'm not saying one is right and the other's wrong. It's just, it's interesting how even within the USSR, the former SSRs view it differently.
So, like, for me, I'm not as clued up on the history of all of these SSR flags because, again, not taught over here at all. You hear all about Germany, World War II. It's all about that. Again, I kind of feel like Russia kind of goes under the radar when it comes to World War II and the Soviet republics. Yes, like, I guess because, yeah, the Germany and the swastika is like that ultimate pinnacle of evil, like Joey said.
Right.
But would you be able to explain, so for anyone else listening, just why this is so taboo and why these flags are so like symbols of, you know, all negative connotations? Like, were they takeovers of countries? Were there war atrocities committed? Because I reckon some people won't know as much about these. Like, and I'm actually one of them. I'm just curious to know a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, it does depend on the former SSR, but there's a good recent example of this in Ukraine. They have, I forget what the statue is called, but it's like I think it was called the Motherland statue in Kyiv. It is now called the Mother Ukraine statue. And for years and years, they left it up unchanged. Like, it was built by the Soviets, and after Ukraine, all the SSRs became independent. They left the statue up because it's, you know, again, visually striking, I guess. And probably it's huge. It's probably a pain in the ass to, you know, take down or something. But they just recently, like last week, 2 weeks ago, took the hammer and sickle off of it's holding a sword and a shield. On the shield was a hammer and sickle. They just took that off like a week ago and put the trident, like the Ukrainian trizub thing on it instead. But they allowed it to be up there for years and years and years. Granted, with some complaints, because along with the Baltics, Ukraine was one of them that was more strong-armed into being part of the Soviet Union than some of the Central Asian republics, some of the Caucasus republics. But yeah, it's a complicated symbol. Like, in World War II, a lot of the Ukrainians, a lot of Belarusians, like some of the, you know, on the like Eastern Front there, Soviet Western Front, I guess, viewed the Nazis as liberators when they came in. Because in Ukraine, there had been the Holodomor, which was a famine. There's various opinions on whether it was intentional or not by by Moscow. I tend to come down on the side that it seems like it was. So if I'm Ukrainian and I've just had, you know, the government in Moscow starve out my friends and family for 5 years, I forget how long it lasted, then somebody else, whoever it is, comes in and liberates me from that. I'm not asking too many questions, honestly, at that point. I'm just going to say, hey, thank you. Then obviously the harsh reality starts to set in of who liberated you. But, you know, in that moment, you're just glad that you're not with that guy anymore. And like Joey and I've talked about, like the Baltics were probably the most strong-armed. When were they incorporated? It was like very early.
1940. So they were actually illegally annexed against their will by
the
Soviet Union. So it was for their protection from Germany, and they did not want it.
Right.
In came the Soviets, you know, under the guise of, you know, you're going to do this, or we're going to destroy you. So they wound up getting rid of the people in charge of the governments in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, putting in friendly puppets who said, yes, come on in. We want your protection.
Mm-hmm.
And, one thing led to another, and they were annexed. What Soviet Russia did upon entering the Baltics was essentially genocide. They either executed outright, politicians, intelligentsia, a lot of people they considered threats, and they physically deported tens of thousands of others to gulags in Siberia with nothing but the clothes on their backs. And many of these people were elderly, they were women, they were children, so it was the death sentence.
Mm-hmm.
They then replaced those people with ethnic Russians. Which is why, particularly in the eastern parts of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, you see people who speak Russian and might be a little more, culturally aligned to Russia versus their home countries, because they are descended from people who were put there, Russians who were put there by the Soviet government. So
yeah,
it's something that a lot of people don't realize. I didn't realize that had happened until I looked into it. It's happening today in Ukraine, in the occupied parts of Ukraine, where there are tens of thousands of people, children especially, who are being deported. I don't know if they're being replaced by ethnic Russians or not, but Russia's still doing what Russia always does.
Safe to say that Russification has been a thing since time immemorial. Like even before the Soviet Union, they were trying to do this shit. So
yeah. And it's interesting going to those. I can only talk to the Baltics because that's where I've been, but if you look at how they weathered the occupation, they each did it to varying degrees of, okay, we came out of this and we're thriving, or we came out of this and we're surviving. And I think Lithuania seems to have taken the biggest brunt of it. When I was, on tour there in Vilnius, which is their capital city, you see all these beautiful buildings and churches, and then you go inside and they're completely hollowed out. And they were hollowed out because the Soviet government decided, you don't need this house of worship, you don't need this theater, we're going to make this into a tractor factory, we're going to make this into something else. And everything that was culturally significant to the people of these three countries was completely destroyed. And their goal was to erase their ethnic identity and, to your point, have Russification, where you identify as Russian, or at least Russian adjacent.
Yeah. So I think, like overall, it depended on if you came willingly or not. And a lot of the stands came willingly, said, yeah, sure, we're not doing so hot, you can modernize us. I'm simplifying it a lot, but whereas others were just outright annexed, which has connotations and everything along with that. But
I would encourage anybody who visits any of the Baltics, the capital cities will have an occupation museum. I visited the one in Tallinn, Estonia, and it's incredibly eye-opening, not just to how life was for the people who lived under the occupation, but what the penalties were if you didn't go along with the party line, if you didn't assimilate to the Soviet Borg, as I like to call it. It was incredibly brutal. I mean, to even own a tiny little, Estonian flag, as an example, was punishable by death.
Right. Yeah.
And people would, to preserve their ethnicity, their identity, they would have these tiny little flags and they would hide them on their person or somewhere in their house, because they wouldn't dare fly, the 3x5 or the 4x6 flag, because to do so, you're dead.
The episode I did with you, Betsy in the Baltics, I think we touched on some of that.
Yeah.
Sorry, Tareth, what were you saying as you take a drink?
Yeah, no, cheers for that. Good timing. No, I was saying the same with in Finland as well, with the flag, the whole trying to keeping this copy of the Finnish flag, exactly the same story, as well. But Stalin had this thing going on years before even the war started, didn't he? About moving huge swathes of people around the empire, the Soviet as a whole, for whatever reason, and almost as if trying to spread the population around. But obviously, it was a lot harsher than that. So this had been going on before the war actually started. His remit was. As you've already alluded to, about play by our rules, and we're going to take over, and we're in charge here. And if you don't like it, then I'll find a nice part of Siberia that you can go and live in for the rest of your days, which won't be many. So it seemed to be a practice of his way before even joining forces with the rest of the UK and people before them. So yeah, it's. But going back to your point though, Dave, none of that's really ever covered in any wide open spaces and general knowledge of, yeah, that's how it was. It was, and again, we tend to forget that the Russians were on our side because of the connotations of the Soviets are a bad group of people and they've done a lot of bad stuff. And yes, they have. So we tend to forget about that sort of link during the Second World War, that we were standing shoulder to shoulder with this group somehow.
Yeah, I always found that interesting because when, obviously Germany screwed up trying to take on Russia, which because he was paranoid that Russia and Winston Churchill, like Stalin and Winston Churchill, were joining forces against him, which they actually weren't, but he was paranoid. And that's when he decided to take out Russia and head over the Russian front. But ultimately, Stalin and Winston Churchill did have to team up to end things. And, you kind of, I guess I kind of view Russia as kind of the good guys in that war, but not really because, it didn't start out like that. And I guess I've just never really known so much about the SSR flags. I guess to summarize it for those learning, like myself, even right now, it's they were all countries that Russia wanted as part of their empire, and they were right. You're joining us, or we're taking it. Is that kind of where all these republics came from? Like
more or less, some of them were already part of it was the Russian Empire before that. Some of them weren't independent. I don't know the status of all the stands in particular before that, but I think like Georgia, where Stalin was born, I think was part of the Russian Empire before the revolution. I could be wrong about that. But more or less, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, they were the greatest flags on it, were they? A lot of them.
I like the OG one, the USSR one. I mean, yeah, again, it has the connotations and everything, but physically, I think it looks good. I also think it's interesting. The flag right behind Tracy there, the DDR, like the East German flag, has a hammer and a compass. So instead of a sickle, it's a hammer compass, and that like wreath thing that goes up around it that's got like the German flag colored ribbons, identical to the Soviet stuff. Like I don't know if you can tell, but like that with the wheat and obviously they had a lot of languages. So every time they picked up a republic, they would add like that republic's language to the thing. But it started off as a smaller version, kind of like the one behind Tracy there. So I think it's interesting symbolism that keeps getting, used and reused in different ways. Remixed. I think it's the American Communist Party has an iteration on it where it's a hammer in the middle. And then I think like part of it goes up as a sickle and part of it goes up as like a cog-wheel. Like I said, there's the DPRK flag, like for the army, has a sword in the middle, or no, it has like a paintbrush in the middle. I don't know. It's weird.
and China nearly adopted it, didn't they?
I mean, yeah, that's the other thing too, is like China, Vietnam, like the color scheme. I think out of all of our flags, well, I mean, Joey's is red, white, and blue, so you could argue. But like the color scheme of the Soviet one, definitely, I think they won in that regard. Like you see any flag that's just red and gold, red and yellow, you probably know the politics of that country, or you can take a educated guess anyway. So as far as symbolism, again, like all I can say is I like it aesthetically, and I think it works like as symbolism, and it proliferated. So as a designer, I think that's pretty much what you want it to do. So success in that, in that way anyway.
I will add one comment about the Soviet flag that differentiates it from the other flags that were national flags during their heyday, is that the actions, the tyranny committed under that flag went on for the better part of a century.
Yep.
Under the Soviet flag versus the other two flags. So
the death toll of this flag is higher than potentially the three of yours combined. Probably. I'm sure it is.
Yeah.
You're right.
That's insane.
So to end on a light note.
No, it is a serious topic, and that's why we wanted to cover it. And I think it is good to try and educate people about these flags, and if it does even help one person who thinks, "Oh, I've got a cool T-shirt with the Confederate flag on it, and it's just a cool shirt," because it's been merchandised so well over the years. It has, to the point where it was a TV show that people enjoyed watching.
Yeah.
I think there's that opportunity to actually just remind people that it's a symbol of hate, and that is actually what it is. There's no getting away from that. There really isn't. And it's the same for all these,
Did you ever, to Tareth and Tracy and Dave, did you ever see a show called Married with Children?
Yes.
Yes.
A sitcom here. So if you look at the first season of Married with Children, oftentimes Kelly Bundy will have a jacket with the Confederate flag patch, among other patches, but the Confederate flag is there. And it was just, one of those things at the time where it was being branded a certain way when it really meant something else. And, it just took this long for it to finally, get through to people that this is not what you think it is.
I think part of that is like the branding too. Like a lot of, we call it the rebel flag, and like just those two words together sound awesome. Like, Joey, you have a rebel flag, right? But it's the Star Wars rebel flag.
Yes.
Like, there's different, like, being a rebel is historically, especially for like teenagers, and like she was the young person on the show, one of them. Like, yeah, it's seen as like, oh, it's rebellious and cool, so this is the rebel flag. What's wrong with that? It's branding.
That's exactly what happened on that same documentary I mentioned earlier. They mentioned the period of time where university students and people of older teenagers, it did become trendy to be a rebel, and they were using it in that way. It was just like the social fad at the time to get something with a Confederacy flag on it and like be a rebel and just like be cool. And that's crazy that it was even a thing. Like, it should never have got that far, because it's watered it down to the point where the current generations who don't know think it's just a cool logo from a TV show, or, oh yeah, it's cool to be a rebel, but it's just so much worse than that. It's crazy. Yeah.
Growing up in Tennessee, we learned about it. Thankfully, the one thing that Tennessee education at least did right at the time, I don't know if it does anymore, but we learned about it mostly accurately, and learned that, don't wear this, don't fly this, don't do this, which is why, like, when I went, my dad's from Ohio, and like, sorry, I'll keep this short, but like, we went up to Ohio, one of the first times I was, cognizant and looking around and like looking out the windows and stuff, seeing rebel flags flying up there. And I was like, because my context of it at that point was from school, it was the losing side, it was the South, Ohio was in the North, blah, blah, blah. So I was like, Dad, like, why would people on the winning side fly the flag of the losing side? And he was like, I will remember what he said to me forever. He was like, there are bad people everywhere. And I think he just left it at that. And I was like, he just let me stew in that and think about what that meant. And I was like, okay, fair enough.
I'm actually impressed that they addressed that in your school.
They did. Yeah. Yeah. We took Tennessee history specifically in 5th grade or 6th grade. I think it was 6th grade, because I think it was middle school, just barely. But yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm sure they could have taught it more accurately, but I don't know. They did a decent job. It helped that my teacher was a very good teacher as well.
We did not learn about that in North Carolina history. We learned all about slavery. They were incredibly blunt about that. Although I suspect I'm quite a bit older than you are, so maybe that has a lot to do with it as well.
It could be, and sorry, I know I said I keep this short, but like, part of it too is like, I grew up in East Tennessee, and East Tennessee tried to secede from Tennessee when Tennessee seceded from the U.S., if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So how West Virginia broke off from Virginia and stayed to the north. Yeah. East Tennessee tried to do the same thing, mostly along economic lines. Like, it's mountainous. The soil is clay. It's not good for growing things. There weren't plantations or needs for them. So, we tried to not be part of Tennessee, the part that was breaking away. And so I think maybe in Knoxville and East Tennessee, they teach it a little differently than they would in Nashville or Memphis, but I don't know. Couldn't swear to it.
Makes sense then. Oh, cool. Well, shall we make that a wrap? That's been absolutely fascinating, actually, digging up all this stuff on these flags. And I think we've done it justice. to be fair. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've got a Jerry Springer closing thought just to finish off. if you want me to go down that route.
Yes.
Okay. Exploring the reasons why flags such as the Soviet, Nazi, Confederate, and Japan's rising flags are rightfully censored, banned, and classified as taboo has shed light on the complex interplay between historical significance, ideology, and contemporary sensitivities. These flag symbols, painful chapters in our collective past, often represent ideologies that populate violence, division, oppression, and hatred. Censoring and banning these flags serves as a necessary step in acknowledging and respecting the profound impact that they have on individuals and communities affected by their dark histories. It also stands as a reminder of the importance of, well, as we've already said, education and safeguarding human rights, promoting inclusivity, and striving for a more equitable and compassionate world. I'll thank Dave, Tracy, Joey, Andy, and I'm Tareth. And thank you at home for taking the time to listen. Until next time, goodbye.
Catch you guys.
Flagged for Content is a Flags for Good podcast. Go to flagsforgood.com for more info.